In the final frostbitten days of November 1950, Colonel Wang Jiang of the Chinese 79th Division sat in a makeshift command post carved into the frozen earth of North Korea, staring at a map of the Chosin Reservoir. His fingers, blackened by early-stage frostbite, could barely hold the graphite pencil as he compiled his tactical debriefing notes for the 9th Army Group High Command. On paper, the mathematical calculus of the operation was absolute, an unassailable equation of victory that guaranteed the total annihilation of the 1st Marine Division. 120,000 disciplined, winter-hardened Chinese soldiers had completely enveloped a fraction of that number, trapping the Americans in a wasteland where the temperature had plummeted to -40 degrees. The mountain passes were choked with ice, the supply lines were severed, and the weapon oil had frozen into a thick, useless paste that jammed firing pins. By every established law of operational warfare, the isolated American garrison at Hagaru-ri should have dissolved into panic, scattering into the frozen ridges to be cut down in detail. Yet, as Colonel Wang recorded the opening phases of the engagement, his handwriting betrayed a profound, unsettling realization that defied 30 years of his own combat experience. "We had the perfect trap," Wang noted in the margins of his official report. "The weather was our ally, freezing their weapons, but the Marines did not behave like a trapped animal. They did not run. They attacked our blocking positions with a mechanical, frozen rage. This was the combat paradox that derailed the entire Chinese winter offensive, an anomaly that Wang and his staff spent decades trying to comprehend. The strategic stakes were absolute, as a breakthrough by the Chinese forces would have unhinged the entire United Nations front, driving the Western alliance completely off the Korean peninsula. The Chinese command assumed that the combination of overwhelming numbers and a hostile environment would shatter the psychological cohesion of the American defenders within 48 hours. Instead, they encountered an adversary that treated the catastrophic environment not as a reason to surrender, but as a grim structural reality to be integrated into their defensive geometry. In his private journals, which remained classified in Beijing for generations, Wang Jiang recorded a haunting observation regarding a specific, heavily contested sector of the Hagaru-ri perimeter. He noted that after the initial night of contact, his veteran assault troops flatly refused to advance into that designated zone, whispering tales of what they termed the ghosts of Hagaru-ri. The Chinese soldiers believed they were fighting something fundamentally non-human, an entity that survived conditions meant to kill every living thing. Wang himself struggled to find a rational military explanation for why his columns, despite achieving total tactical surprise and immense numerical superiority, were being systematically ground to pieces by an enemy that had nowhere left to retreat. The answer lay hidden within the frozen foxholes of the 1st Marine Division, where young men from distant American cities were transforming a desperate survival struggle into a calculated, aggressive breakout. They were about to demonstrate that the worst weather nature could produce, combined with the maximum force an empire could muster, was insufficient to break their alignment. The truth of what occurred on those ice-locked ridges would only emerge when the after-action reports of both sides were unsealed, revealing a narrative not of cinematic heroism, but of an unbreakable institutional refusal to die. The tactical environment surrounding the Chosin Reservoir was an absolute vacuum of comfort, a barren expanse of jagged granite and frozen mud situated along the spine of the Taebaek Mountains. By late November, the North Korean winter had settled over the region like a physical weight, dropping the temperature to levels that cracked steel rifle receivers and froze vehicle transmission fluid solid. The Chinese 9th Army Group had moved into this sub-zero wilderness with immense stealth, marching only by night and hiding under pine boughs by day to avoid aerial detection. Their commanders possessed total confidence in their operational plan, believing they had engineered an inescapable meat grinder for the advancing United Nations forces. Intelligence briefs distributed to the Chinese senior staff painted a specific, derogatory picture of the American troops, describing them as products of a soft, capitalist society who relied too heavily on mechanized comfort and massive logistical tails. The Chinese High Command reasoned that once these men were cut off from their heated tents, warm rations, and heavy artillery support, their psychological endurance would vaporize. They were wrong. The primary target of the Chinese encirclement was the 1st Marine Division, a formation that operated under an entirely different institutional calculus than what the enemy anticipated. These were not soft conscripts, but men shaped by a brutal training philosophy designed specifically for the moments when all conventional logic crumbled. The division was a diverse cross-section of mid-century America, containing men like 21-year-old Corporal Arthur Myers, a machinist's son from the crowded neighborhoods of Boston, Massachusetts, who had spent his youth working in the damp chill of New England shipyards. Beside him stood men like Sergeant Frank Davis, a 24-year-old former foundry worker from Detroit, Michigan, who understood the precise tolerance of heavy machinery and the grueling reality of sustained physical labor. The training these men underwent at Camp Pendleton and Paris Island did not promise them superhuman capabilities or painless victories. It instilled a mechanical, deliberate adherence to small unit doctrine, a discipline that mandated that when a perimeter was compromised, the surviving personnel did not look backward for escape routes. They looked inward, tightening their lines and increasing their volume of fire until the gap was sealed. This institutional conditioning removed retreat from the spectrum of acceptable tactical choices, replacing it with an aggressive, reflexive habit of counter-attacking into the teeth of an ambush. As the Chinese divisions completed their secret deployment along the ridgelines overlooking the single, narrow dirt road that served as the American supply route, the disparity between expectation and reality reached its peak. The Chinese soldiers waited in their thin, cotton-padded uniforms, shivering in the bone-cold wind, convinced that the approaching trucks and jeeps contained an army of soft targets ripe for destruction. They did not realize they were closing the trap on an organization that viewed an encirclement not as a fatal disaster, but as a rare opportunity to engage the enemy from all four quadrants simultaneously. The stage was set for a collision between two diametrically opposed concepts of military endurance, with the vast, frozen wilderness of the reservoir serving as the ultimate arbiter of their faith. The assault commenced at precisely 10 o'clock on the night of November 27th, accompanied by a sudden, deafening chorus of brass horns, whistles, and wooden rattles that echoed off the frozen slopes. From his observation post overlooking Hagaru-ri, Colonel Wang Jiang watched as the white-clad infantry of the Chinese 79th Division surged out of the tree line, blending seamlessly with the blowing snow. The attackers moved with absolute speed, utilizing the blizzard as a tactical shield to close the distance before the defenders could register their presence. They fully expected to find a panicked, disoriented enemy huddled around their heaters, unable to mount a coherent defense in the blinding storm. Instead, the moment the first Chinese skirmishers crossed the outer perimeter wire, the entire valley exploded into an interlocking grid of defensive fire. The Americans did not hesitate. The sudden, rhythmic roar of heavy Browning machine guns severed the mountain silence, tracing bright crimson lines of tracer ammunition through the dark. The sheer velocity of the response stunned the advancing columns, causing the first wave of the assault to falter as the suppressive geometry of the marine defensive positions tore through the packed infantry. Wang observed that when the American lines were compressed, their fire discipline did not degrade. It actually improved, becoming a dense, impenetrable envelope of lead. On the southern sector of the perimeter, Corporal Arthur Myers found himself crouching in a shallow, ice-choked machine gun pit as the wave of white uniforms advanced up the slope toward his position. The intense cold had caused the lubricating oil on his weapon to seize, rendering the heavy machine gun temporarily useless as the enemy closed to within 30 yards. In that critical fraction of a second, when a hasty retreat down the reverse slope was the only logical means of survival, Myers made a deliberate, calculated decision to stay. He grabbed his short, steel-entrenching tool from the frozen mud, his bare hands sticking to the freezing metal as the skin tore away in the sub-zero air. When the first Chinese soldiers breached the parapet, Myers fought with a silent mechanical fury, using the heavy iron spade to defend the lip of the pit and keep his position from being overrun. His actions gave the rest of his squad the precious seconds needed to clear their jammed actions and bring their weapons back into the fight. The line held. 200 yards to the west, Sergeant Frank Davis was experiencing a similar breakdown of conventional tactical variables. Severe frostbite had already destroyed the nerve endings in both of his feet, turning his boots into heavy blocks of agonizing ice that made every step a monumental act of physical will. When a midnight mortar blast severed the communication lines between his command post and the forward listening posts, Davis refused to remain behind the safety of the sandbags. He dragged himself upright, leading a scratch force of cooks, clerks, and wounded men directly into the swirling blizzard to plug a dangerous gap in the defensive line. The copper taste of physical exhaustion filled his mouth as he fired his carbine into the shadows, his breath crystallizing into ice on his collar before it could dissipate into the air. The Chinese attackers found themselves trapped in a psychological nightmare, watching their comrades fall in droves against an enemy that seemed entirely indifferent to both the overwhelming numbers and the lethal temperature. Intercepted letters and diaries later recovered from the snow revealed that the Chinese soldiers began to experience a profound sense of dread as the night wore on. They had been promised an easy victory over a broken, retreating adversary, but they were instead grinding themselves to pieces against a wall of frozen flesh and unyielding steel. The assault waves continued to throw themselves against the perimeter until dawn, but each successive attempt was met with the same cold, calculated resistance, forcing Colonel Wang to realize that the psychological pivot of the battle had shifted irreversibly away from his command. By 3 o'clock in the morning on November 28th, the operational calculus of the Chinese Ninth Army Group had narrowed to a single, desperate gamble. Colonel Wang Jung ordered his final, most powerful reserve formations into the meat grinder, committing every available mortar tube and infantry platoon to a massive concentrated thrust aimed directly at the center of the Hagaru-ri defensive line. The Chinese commanders poured thousands of fresh, winter-hardened troops down the snow-slicked ravines, determined to overwhelm the American positions through sheer physical momentum before the sun could rise. On the receiving end of this human wave, the situation within the perimeter of the 1st Marine Division had reached a point of absolute catastrophic exhaustion. Ammunition stockpiles were critically depleted. The cold had frozen the grease inside the remaining machine gun mechanisms, and over half of the defenders were suffering from varying degrees of severe frostbite and blood loss. The air inside the foxholes was thick with the scent of cordite, frozen blood, and the metallic tang of pure survival adrenaline. Shifted inside the shallow earthworks, the internal world of the individual Marines narrowed from the sweeping strategic movements of divisions on a map to the immediate, visceral defense of a single yard of frozen dirt. The men were no longer fighting for global geopolitical objectives or grand military strategies. They were operating on an intimate, fundamental level of mutual preservation. Corporal Arthur Myers lay across the rim of his battered pit, his hands so numb from the sub-zero air that he could no longer feel the trigger of his rifle. Yet his mind remained fixed on the specific, ordinary details of his family's home in Boston. Beside him, Sergeant Frank Davis ignored the deadening paralysis spreading upward from his frozen feet, choosing to drag his body along the ice to redistribute the remaining clips of ammunition to his surviving riflemen. A wounded medic refused to be evacuated to the rear, stating simply that he was too busy to leave because his guys were still on the line and needed his hands to keep from bleeding out in the snow. This was not a manifestation of Hollywood fearlessness or blind, unthinking bravery, but the execution of a prior institutional decision that retreat was simply not an available option on their tactical spectrum. The final Chinese assault wave crashed against this wall of frozen flesh with immense violence, the combat descending into a chaotic, hand-to-hand struggle in the blinding dark where men used empty rifles, helmets, and ice-crusted rocks to defend their positions. For 2 agonizing hours, the entire perimeter threatened to buckle under the sheer weight of the numerical mismatch, but the internal cohesion of the Marine units remained unbroken, their fire discipline tightening even further as the distance closed to zero. Then, as the first gray light of dawn began to illuminate the snow-covered valley, the momentum of the Chinese attack finally broke against the unyielding geometry of the defense. The surviving attackers, shattered by the mechanical, relentless nature of the resistance, began to fall back into the shadows of the surrounding ridges, leaving behind a wasteland of absolute carnage. It was during this retreat that the mystery of the specific sector the Chinese troops refused to assault was finally resolved. As Wang Jiang's journals later revealed that his men had encountered an American machine gun crew that had frozen to death while still gripping their weapons, the Chinese soldiers had mistaken these frozen, unmoving silhouettes for live combatants who were entirely indifferent to both the lethal environment and their own mortal wounds, creating the myth of the ghosts of Hagaru-ri that paralyzed the attackers' resolve. 10,000 men, 1 ridge, 17 hours, 3,000 enemy dead the line held. The intelligence memoranda and after-action reports filed by the senior commanders of the Chinese Ninth Army Group in the weeks following the Chosin breakout read less like military assessments and more like clinical examinations of a baffling psychological phenomenon. Divisional staff officers meticulously charted the expenditure of their own ammunition, the rate of advance of their infantry columns, and the exact coordinates of their heavy mortar strikes, yet the operational mathematics refused to balance. According to every established tenet of Marxist-Leninist military doctrine, an army that had lost its logistical cohesion, its heavy transport, and its territorial insulation should have collapsed under the weight of a multi-axis encirclement. Colonel Wang Jiang spent late December of 1950 supervising the collection of data from the abandoned American positions around Hagaru-ri, searching for the specific tactical variable that had unhinged his division's offensive calculus. His official submission to General Song Shilun focused heavily on what he described as the psychological immovability of the 1st Marine Division, a characteristic that defied standard tactical neutralization. Wang argued that the traditional methodology of encirclement relied on creating a state of existential panic within the enclosed pocket, a sense of isolation that shattered the soldier's faith in his command structure and forced a general surrender. In his analytical brief, which remained buried in the confidential archives of the People's Liberation Army for over half a century, Wang attempted to articulate the core of the tactical failure. How do you break men who have decided not to break? Wang wrote in his final summary, noting that the American units appeared to operate with an almost industrial indifference to their own survival. He observed that when a Marine platoon was entirely isolated on a ridgeline, without wireless communication or flanking support, the individual riflemen did not look for an escape route or attempt to negotiate a surrender. They simply adjusted their fire envelopes, pooled their remaining ammunition, and continued to execute their defensive doctrine until they were either reinforced or annihilated. This professional assessment was echoed in the post-war memoirs of veteran Chinese officers who returned to the study of the Chosin Reservoir campaign throughout the latter half of the 20th century, treating the engagement as an analytical puzzle that defied easy categorization. They recognized that their own troops had fought with immense valor and endured unimaginable physical hardship, yet they had encountered an institutional culture that viewed the battlefield through a lens of absolute, unyielding discipline. One highly decorated regiment commander later recorded a poignant, reluctant validation of his former adversaries in a privately published monograph, noting that the Americans had managed to turn the very concept of defeat inside out. They did not behave like an army that had been outmaneuvered and trapped in a frozen wasteland, the veteran wrote, but rather like a precise piece of machinery that continued to cut through our lines until the operational space was cleared. This clinical, devastatingly honest tribute from an experienced adversary confirmed that the true decisive factor at the Chosin Reservoir was not a matter of technological superiority or geographic fortune, but the quiet, immovable resolve of men who had discarded the very possibility of retreat before the first shot was fired. When the survivors of the 1st Marine Division finally boarded the transport ships at the frozen docks of Hungnam, leaving the jagged ridges of the Chosin Reservoir behind them, they did not carry themselves like characters in a victory parade. They were battered, frostbitten, and wrapped in torn woolen blankets, their faces hardened into expressionless masks by weeks of sustained sub-zero combat. Within a few months, the vast machinery of post-war demobilization took effect, and these men were systematically scattered back across the length and breadth of the American landscape, returning to the quiet, ordinary environments from which they had been pulled. Corporal Arthur Myers returned to the damp, gray winters of Boston, Massachusetts, where he quietly took up his pre-war position in the local machine shops, his hands bearing the faint, pale scars of torn skin where they had frozen to his steel entrenching tool on the perimeter of Hagaru-ri. He rarely spoke of the Taebaek Mountains to his co-workers or his children, keeping his standard-issue medals tucked away inside an unmarked cardboard shoebox at the bottom of a bedroom closet. A few states away, in the industrial heart of Detroit, Michigan, Sergeant Frank Davis resumed his grueling shifts at the automotive foundry, walking with a subtle, permanent limp that his neighbors attributed to a generic workplace injury rather than the severe frostbite that had destroyed the nerve endings in his feet. He became an elementary school teacher in his later years, meticulously instructing generations of children in the standard chapters of mid-century global history without once mentioning his own name or the fact that he had led a scratch force of clerks and wounded men through a North Korean blizzard to preserve the integrity of a collapsing United Nations front line. This absolute protective silence became the defining characteristic of the Chosin veterans, who collectively chose to bury the visceral memory of the copper taste of exhaustion and the bone-cold mud beneath the routine rhythms of domestic civilian life. Their grandchildren grew up entirely unaware that the quiet, unassuming men sitting at the family dinner table had once been viewed by an opposing empire as non-human entities, as frozen statues of ice that refuse to fall. There is a profound historical irony in the realization that the most complete, unvarnished record of what these men accomplished does not exist in the popular memory of their own homeland, but within the classified after-action reports and intelligence memoranda stored in the military archives of their former adversaries. The precise calculus of their resistance was measured and recorded by the very commanders who had tried and failed to destroy them, serving as a clinical testament to an organization that treated the combination of a catastrophic environment and a massive numerical disadvantage as manageable operational factors. The grand strategies of the Korean conflict have long since faded into the academic background of modern textbooks, yet the memory of that specific institutional discipline remains completely intact, preserved in the solemn reality of the ridges where the line held. They had proved that when an organization completely removes the concept of retreat from its available spectrum of choices, the conventional laws of tactical mathematics cease to apply, leaving behind a legacy that requires no embellishment to retain its devastating weight.